Among the many mountains and trees that give Western Oregon its unique personality lies a tiny town you've probably never heard of. This is a town that would likely not exist at all had it not been for a power play by one of its first residents, selling land for only $1 to an expanding railroad with an unusual catch: that they must build a town here. Welcome to Drain, Oregon. This isn't the kind of place that you ever see advertised as a tourist destination on a highway billboard. In fact, it's not even really a place you would likely ever hear of at all if you aren't from this area. Drain has an appeal all its own, with its rows of old storefronts and houses and an overall laid-back, homey vibe. Although there are a growing number of empty buildings, Drain has such a cool feel, almost mysterious as I walked around in this overcast morning. Yet, it has a story that sounds made up, but it's not. This is the real-life story of how Drain, Oregon came to be. In 1850, the Donation Land Claim Act was passed. Under this act, Warren Goodell claimed 320 acres of wild Oregon territory here. He later sold the property in 1858, and a few years after that, in 1861, it was sold yet again to the town's namesake, Charles Drain. The area at that time was just a modest farming community with no town or city center. Things would quickly change, though. In 1872, the Oregon and California Railroad entered the scene. They were building a rail line through northern Douglas County and needed land to build on in this area. Charles Drain dangled a business prospect in front of them so tempting that it was almost too good to believe. He would sell 60 acres of his property to the railroad for the low price of only $1. However, there was a catch, a big one. In exchange for the cheap deal, the land would have to be surveyed and a town site platted here. So that's what happened, and a town was formed, named after the man smart enough to create a little hub in the middle of the nothingness surrounding this wild area: Drain. It's fascinating how quickly Drain grew in the following years, including a hotel, a mercantile, a hardware store, a drugstore, and many other commercial buildings. However, one of Drain's major claims to fame was that for nearly 30 years at the turn of the century, it was the site of the Western Oregon State Normal School, which trained teachers who would go and teach all over the state, educating Oregon students for decades to come. Eventually, this school would move to Monmouth and become what is today Western Oregon University. Through the years, multiple fires would wipe out much of the downtown area. This might be absolutely devastating for some towns, but not here. After each fire, Drain was rebuilt almost identically to how it was set up prior to the fires, keeping the feel of this community consistent, even after multiple disasters. Fires couldn't dampen the spirit of this little town. Drain does have one rather sad claim to fame, though. In 1904, Drain was the final place to record an Oregon sighting of a wild California condor. After that, in this region, they simply vanished, never to be seen here again. That's not the end of the story, though. It seemed that things were looking up again when in 1906, Drain was set to have another major growth spurt, thanks again to the railroad, when Southern Pacific sank $1.5 million into a rail line connecting Drain to Coos Bay. However, that project was abruptly abandoned, leaving mile after mile of graded land in the forest still sitting there today, where there was supposed to have been a railroad. A fleeting historical moment of hope for a tiny mountain community became the ghost of a non-existent rail line, a line that could have been a catalyst for change here. At the close of World War II, the lumber industry became one of the last major economic drivers remaining in this community. Sawmills were one of the most happening things in town at that time. However, this little city of only around 1,200 people received national attention when their semi-professional baseball team, the Drain Black Sox, won the national championship. Not bad for the hometown team from a place that most of the nation had never even heard of before. Today, Drain calls itself the Gateway to the Pacific, a title that seems to fit quite well. I can verify that the views heading west from here are pretty stunning, with miles and miles of roads that wind through wild country, eventually reaching the magnificent west coast. If you're thinking of visiting Drain, don't expect big touristy sites or fancy gimmicks to get you here. The draw for visitors here is simple: to get away from and forget about the world, a job that this town does quite well. We'll see you next time somewhere else down the road.